Reverend Hartwell arrived in Massachusetts in the last days of winter, when the snow clung to the roofs like old skin that refused to shed. He stepped down from the coach with the same poise as a man walking into a court he already owned, his black coat heavy with frost, his eyes calm as if nothing in the world could disturb him. The parish had been without a minister for months, though no one in the village could recall the last sermon with any fondness. What they did remember, though they spoke of it rarely, was that the bells had not rung for the dead in more than a year. Graves were dug in secret now, if they were dug at all, and sometimes the earth was turned in the night without anyone having seen a coffin brought in. For strangers, the absence of sound was the first thing they noticed. For the locals, it had become a kind of pact. They understood the silence, though no one had agreed to it aloud. Hartwell carried little with him, only a trunk and a small iron-bound box that he kept close to his chest even when the driver offered to take it. The townsfolk had been told of his discipline of the soul by letters from Boston, and those words, heavy with the suggestion of moral strength, were enough to quiet any doubts. They did not know what discipline meant in his hands. They did not yet know that it was not a sermon he intended to bring them, but a regimen, one that used the body as a tool to break the mind. He came from England with a past that had been written over, his reputation cleansed by the church itself. The few who might have spoken against him were buried in foreign soil, though the manner of their deaths had been neither natural nor merciful. In his first week he walked the length of the graveyard alone, taking note of each headstone and the ground between them. He lingered over the older graves, the ones where the earth had sunken in odd shapes where no grass grew, as though the soil itself refused to heal. There were unmarked mounds there too, recent ones, and he studied these with a stillness that made the sexton uneasy. The sexton asked whether he should ready the bells for the next burial, but Hartwell told him no. There would be no more ringing. He said the sound of bells roused the unworthy dead. That silence was the only way to keep the soul in its place. The words settled over the sexton like a shroud, though he nodded and obeyed. The first body disappeared that month. It belonged to a young woman who had died of fever. Her coffin was placed in the ground in the morning, and by nightfall, the grave had been opened, the box gone. The villagers pretended not to notice, but they watched Hartwell more closely after that. He showed no surprise, no outrage, only preached the next Sunday on the dangers of clinging to the flesh when the soul had already departed. His sermons had a way of winding into the mind, laying out ideas so simply that they seemed natural even when they were wrong. Soon he had the congregation agreeing that it was better for the body to be put to use than left to rot. What that use was, he did not explain. By spring, there were 5 unaccounted for dead. Each had been buried without the bells, each removed within a day. Rumors began to spread quietly, whispered in kitchens and behind closed doors. Some said Hartwell was sending the bodies to Boston for medical study, others that he was preventing a sickness from spreading. The truth was less forgivable. Hartwell's past in England had taught him that fear could be harvested slowly, like sap from a tree, and that a community could be bent to accept any cruelty if it was wrapped in the language of piety. He had overseen a similar silence before in a village near York where suspected sinners were disciplined in ways that left them praying for death. That village had lost its voice long before it lost its people. What the parishioners did not see, or did not want to see, were the small signs of his method. A boy's shoe found in the churchyard, the leather cut in a perfect circle at the toe. A strip of linen stiff with something dark and sticky found behind the pulpit. The smell of heated metal from the rectory late at night. These were not accidents. They were the beginnings of a system Hartwell had used before, rituals of restraint, of deprivation, of pain administered so precisely it could be mistaken for care. Those taken from their coffins were not all dead when he found them. Some had been buried ill but breathing, their weakness mistaken for the stillness of death. Hartwell had a way of making such errors seem divine in origin, and once in his hands, the return to life became a sentence worse than the grave they had escaped. It was not violence for the sake of blood that drove him, but the slow breaking of spirit. The missing were subjected to hours of calculated suffering, bound in positions that caused the muscles to spasm and seize, denied water until their tongues cracked and bled, made to listen to scripture whispered in the dark while their own breath became the only clock they could measure. When they finally died, it was not from a single wound but from the collapse of the self, the surrender of every human will. Hartwell believed such deaths purified the soul and demonstrated the supremacy of his hand over God's own. The town was not ready to call it murder. To them, the Reverend was a guardian who asked for obedience in exchange for safety. They told themselves the vanished had been claimed by the Lord, not taken by the man in the black coat. The truth was too heavy to speak. The bells remained silent, the air heavy with a kind of listening. And Hartwell, with his calm voice and careful hands, was only beginning. His work in England had taught him patience. Here, in this quiet New England parish, he would have all the time he needed. The silence would hold until it became natural, until no one thought to ask why it had begun at all. The vestry smelled of cold wood and candle smoke, a place meant for quiet prayers and private counsel. Yet behind the locked cupboard, in a drawer whose key Hartwell kept on a chain around his neck, lay the ledger. Its cover was blackened with age, the leather polished smooth by years of careful handling. Inside there were no names, no dates of birth or death. Instead, each entry was marked with a symbol, an open scalpel, a sun crossed by a crescent, a chalice inverted. Some were ancient alchemical signs, others drawn from the grim corners of church history, icons once used to mark heretics or the unclean. Each symbol meant something to Hartwell alone, though the patterns told a story to anyone willing to see. These were not simple burials. They were catalogued acts of his design, each one an experiment, each one an offering to whatever creed he served in secret. By the second month of winter, the parish began losing the living before their time. Men who had shown no sickness vanished from their beds in the night. Women who had been seen working in the yard at dusk were gone by morning. Their families were summoned to the rectory, where Hartwell would hand them a sealed envelope with an unbroken wax stamp and no explanation. Inside, written in his careful hand, were instructions for mourning. How long to keep the shutters closed, when to wear black, what prayers to speak and in what order. The instructions always forbade speaking the deceased's name aloud, as though naming them might undo what he had done. The families obeyed. The parish was too small to question without consequence. The first body to be seen again was found on the edge of the marsh, discovered by a trapper who recognized the face but not the form. The man's skin was pale as ash, his veins collapsed, his eyes sunken. When the trapper tried to lift him, the body was heavy in a way that felt wrong, its weight not of flesh and bone but of something else. The coroner, who had no wish to invite Hartwell's attention, found that the blood had been drained entirely, replaced with packed clay. This clay was not common earth. It was mixed with ash and crushed herbs, the kind once used in the old Puritan pest houses to weigh the dead before burial, a superstition meant to keep restless spirits from rising. Hartwell had not chosen the method for superstition. He had chosen it for control. The draining was slow, done with deliberate cuts that left the victim alive long enough to feel every ounce of life leaving them. The clay packed into the empty veins while their hearts still tried to beat. It was not death by violence, but by a patient theft of the self, a final reshaping before the last breath. The second to be found had been a mother of 3 taken from her bed without struggle. Her body appeared weeks later in a locked barn on the edge of town, her skin stained gray from the same clay, though her hands had been bound not with rope but with strips of her own burial shroud. This was no accident. Hartwell had begun keeping the shrouds prepared long before his victims were chosen, sewing into them a thread soaked in a resin that hardened when warmed by the body's heat. The bonds constricted over hours, tightening until bone ground against bone. The woman had left marks on the barn floor where her feet had kicked against the boards. To Hartwell, these were signs of purification, the body resisting, the spirit surrendering. Each new symbol in the ledger carried the weight of these methods, but to him, they were not cruelty. They were steps in a greater work, an unbroken chain of trials that he believed would leave only the worthy behind. He was not killing indiscriminately. He selected those he believed had faults of the soul, those who had spoken against him in whispers, those whose grief made them unpredictable, those who kept secrets he had not been told. The symbols became his private scripture, the ledger his gospel. He touched the inked marks with the same reverence others gave to the cross. For the villagers, the disappearances gnawed at their thoughts. They began to measure their days by who was still present, avoiding certain streets at night, never walking alone. Children were told to keep their voices low in church, to bow their heads when Hartwell passed. The fear was not only of vanishing, but of what came after, for by now they understood the missing did not rest. Hartwell's victims returned in forms that defied comfort, bodies altered into grim totems of his belief. The sight of them, even from a distance, eroded the mind. It was not just death the parish feared, it was the knowledge that death under Hartwell was not an ending, but a possession. Hartwell himself moved through the parish with the same composure as before, his sermons steady, his hands folded when he spoke. To those who sought counsel, he offered words of discipline, of cleansing, never of comfort. He presented himself as the keeper of the flock, the one who bore the burden of their souls. In truth, he was harvesting them. Each death was a brick in the structure he built within himself, a structure without walls, without limits. And with each entry in the ledger, he tightened his hold on the living, teaching them through terror to accept the silence that had become their way of life. When the marsh thawed and the ice cracked along the river, the parish counted the winter's losses without ever speaking the number aloud. They did not speak of the ledger either, though they felt its weight as surely as if they had seen it. In the vestry, locked and waiting, it sat on its shelf, ready for the next mark. And Hartwell, with the patience of a man who believed time itself obeyed him, already knew who it would be. The winter thaw came slowly that year, the ground reluctant to yield what it had hidden beneath frost and snow. When the church well began to fail, the sexton was ordered to make repairs. It was meant to be a simple task, the clearing of silt and the shoring up of rotted timbers. But as the water was drained down to the black stones at its base, something unnatural was revealed. Glass glinted in the dim light, rows of jars wedged between the stones like offerings pressed into the walls of a crypt. Each jar held a shape that at first looked like a curled slug or some strange root from the marsh. But as the water cleared, the truth surfaced. Human tongues, pale and bloated, their ends stitched shut with black thread. They floated in salt-water brine, each pinned with a fragment of paper bearing words in Hartwell's meticulous hand. The sexton, pale and shaking, carried one jar to the surface, the air filling with the sour tang of brine and decay. The paper inside was a prayer not of comfort but of condemnation, calling for the silencing of the wicked and the cleansing of the Lord's house. Hartwell stood beside the well as more jars were brought up, his hands clasped as though in prayer, his expression untroubled. He told the gathering crowd that these tongues belonged to blasphemers. to those who had spoken against God and against the unity of the parish. He said their voices had been taken to spare the community from corruption, to keep their poison from spreading. To some, the explanation was almost a relief. To others, it was an unspoken warning. Speech had become dangerous currency, and the cost of spending it was life. What he did not say was that the taking of the tongue was never the end. Hartwell had revived a punishment once used in the 17th century for sedition in England, when the crime of words was met with the violence of silence. But his use of the ritual was not merely to punish. It was to prepare. The removal was done while the victim still lived, the wounds sealed to keep them breathing, their ability to speak gone but their awareness intact. This ensured they could not cry out when the rest of his work began. Each tongue was preserved, catalogued, matched to the ledger's symbols, and kept in the well as a permanent reminder that he decided whose words would live and whose would be drowned. The first to lose his tongue that winter was a young man who had spoken in the tavern of leaving the parish. He was found wandering the edge of the graveyard days later, his mouth stitched shut, his jaw trembling as he tried to make sounds that would not come. He lived long enough for the stitches to rot and the wound to blacken, Hartwell visiting daily with what he called purifying tinctures. By the time he died, fevered and unable to swallow, his body had wasted to half its weight, his eyes fixed in a look of mute pleading that followed the living for weeks after the burial. Others followed. An old woman accused of whispering against Hartwell during the Sunday meal, a farmhand who had been caught telling children stories that did not match scripture, a mother who begged for her husband's body back. Each was taken in the same way, their tongues removed with the precision of a surgeon and replaced with the false comfort of Hartwell's prayers. The act was not loud, not public. It was a slow unthreading of defiance, a warning buried in every silence that followed. The parish began to speak less, their conversations clipped, their opinions left unformed. Even in private, their words came in hushed tones as though Hartwell's ear was pressed to every wall. For Hartwell, each preserved tongue was a victory not only over the body but over the will. In his mind, the voice was the most dangerous part of the soul, the tool by which rebellion and doubt could take root. By removing it, he believed he had stripped away the first layer of sin. When the rest of the ritual began, the deprivation, the reshaping, the final moments when the victim understood they were no longer human in any way that mattered, it happened without interruption, without the ugly noise of panic. It was efficiency cloaked in piety, cruelty masked as moral correction. The well became both reliquary and threat. Those who drew water from it could not help but imagine the brine seeping into their buckets, carrying whispers that no longer had bodies to speak them. The sight of Hartwell standing beside it on Sunday mornings, his eyes scanning the congregation, became a kind of sermon in itself. No one asked again about the repairs. No one wanted to be the next prayer sealed in glass. By the end of that winter, the well was working again, its water clear and cold. Yet beneath its surface lay the weight of dozens of silenced lives, each tongue a marker of the slow violence Hartwell had made into law. The jars remained hidden to all but him, their presence known only through the way the parishioners' speech dwindled to near nothing. Words had become a dangerous luxury, and in their absence, the silence grew thick enough to breathe. Hartwell moved through it like a man walking in his own garden, knowing every root, every seed planted, every bloom that would come in its season. He had no need for the bells, no need for public trials. The parish was learning that death under his hand began long before the body failed, and the final breath was only the last, quiet detail in a process that had started the moment they had dared to speak. The attic of the rectory was not a place the villagers visited, but its presence pressed down on them like a second roof, always there, just above their heads. When the wind shifted, the smell drifted through the eaves, sharp, chemical, almost sweet, and clung to the air inside the church. Those who caught sight of the rafters through the half-open attic door spoke of pale shapes hanging in rows like empty cocoons, their surfaces stiff and glistening. They were funeral shrouds, but unlike any the parish had seen before. Each was coated in a resin that gave it a hard sheen, the fabric locked in place as though it had been dipped in amber. Hartwell explained that they were for the immobilization of the wicked, a practice he claimed mirrored ancient monastic penance, where the body was bound to stillness so the soul could find its way back to God. Few asked how the wicked were chosen. No one asked where the resin came from. The first to vanish after the shrouds appeared was a merchant's widow who had spoken against Hartwell's growing influence. She was seen at Sunday service, gone by Monday morning, her house left unlocked, her tea still warm on the table. Weeks later, Hartwell announced her passing, saying she had been called to the long sleep of repentance. What he did not say was that she had been wrapped alive in one of those resin-coated shrouds, her arms pinned to her sides, her legs fused together. The resin hardened as her body heat rose, the air inside growing hotter and more stale with every passing hour. Breathing became labor, then pain, then a shallow rasp that stretched into days. The hardened fabric pressed into her ribs, the unyielding shell slowly preventing the rise and fall of her chest. She died not in a single moment, but in thousands of small suffocations, each one stealing a fraction more of her will until nothing was left. When Hartwell ordered the shroud removed, the body inside was fragile, the skin creased and pale as though she had been folded into herself. He told the congregation she had been cremated, that her ashes were scattered on consecrated ground, but the night before, a thin column of smoke had risen from the rectory's chimney, and those who passed in the dark said the smell was not of wood or cloth, but of something far denser. Burnt bone fused with melting resin. They did not speak of it aloud. By then the parish had learned the cost of questions. The next victim was taken under cover of the Lenten fast, a young man whose hunger had made him bold enough to complain. Hartwell had him brought quietly to the rectory where a shroud hung waiting. This time, the resin was still soft when the fabric closed around him, seeping into his clothes and hair. As it hardened, it clung to his skin like a second body, shrinking as it set, pulling at the flesh beneath. He was left in the attic's dim light, unable to move, unable to scratch at the itches that came with heat and sweat, the resin tightening with every breath he tried to take. Hartwell visited only to read prayers, placing his hand on the rigid shell as if to feel the sin leaving. When death came, it was not peaceful. The resin cracked under the final spasms, small fissures opening where his body strained against its prison. Hartwell kept the shroud intact, the corpse inside still locked in its final contortion, until the fire took it days later. Word of these deaths traveled in whispers, each retelling carrying the sound of a body struggling against its bonds. Villagers began to look at the attic door with dread, the shapes behind it becoming a constant silent threat. Even those who had not sinned by Hartwell's measure began to wonder if they might be chosen. The shrouds became more than objects. They were a visible promise of the end that awaited anyone who resisted. The thought alone was enough to make hands tremble during prayer, enough to close mouths before dissent could form. Hartwell understood this. The shrouds were not only tools of death, they were tools of rule. He spoke often of discipline, of the need for stillness, of the peace that came from surrendering the body's will. The words were gentle, measured, but they carried the weight of the resin-coated shells above, hanging in their perfect rows. The attic became a kind of unspoken altar, each shroud a relic of his judgment. To the congregation, the creak of the attic boards in the night was a reminder that someone else's turn had come. To Hartwell, it was the sound of his order being kept. As spring crept in, the smell from the chimney came more often, and the villagers learned to close their shutters when it did. They could pretend in the stillness of their homes that it was only the burning of old timber. But the truth seeped in through cracks in the walls, the same way the resin's sweetness lingered in the air long after the fire died. And Hartwell, moving with quiet certainty between pulpit and rectory, knew they understood. The fear was not in the killing. It was in the waiting, in the knowledge that every breath they took might be measured for its worth, and that one day they too might be wrapped in stillness that would not let go until it crushed the last of their life away. Lent began under a sky the color of ash, the air heavy with the promise of a season meant for reflection and restraint. Hartwell used it as a season for something else entirely. He called it the trial of purification, a test for those whose souls, in his words, carried the weight of hidden sins. The chosen were not announced in the open. They were visited in the night, taken quietly from their homes, led through the back entrance of the church and down into the cellar beneath the altar. The floor there was cold stone, the air damp and still, carrying the faint scent of mildew that had seeped into the mortar over decades. Iron chains had been set into the walls, and above each set of shackles hung a wooden crucifix, positioned so that the bound could not avoid its gaze. Hartwell fed them only salted water, just enough to keep their throats from closing, never enough to quench thirst. The salt drew the moisture from their bodies faster, tightening skin over bone until every rib stood out in sharp relief. Their legs grew weak within days, their thoughts slower, though the constant gnawing in their stomachs never let them sleep for long. The cellar was not silent. There was the sound of shallow breathing, the shuffle of feet dragging against chains, and at night, the low murmur of Hartwell's prayers, spoken just loud enough to remind them he was there. The walls bore scripture carved deep into the wood and stone, but between the words, another pattern had formed over time. Rows of small, desperate indentations. Teeth marks left by those who had tried to bite splinters from the beams, chewing wood as if it might become bread in their mouths. Hartwell timed each death with precision, counting the days on his own ledger, aligning the final breath with the feast days of the church calendar. To him, these deaths were offerings, sacrifices meant to restore the moral health of the parish. The symbolism mattered more than the life itself. The first to die that Lent was a man known for speaking too freely in the tavern. Hartwell kept him chained for 39 days, the salted water swelling his tongue until speech became impossible, his eyes sinking deep into their sockets. On the 40th day, the bells of another town's church rang for a feast they celebrated far away, and Hartwell knelt beside the man's body as it slackened, his hands folded as if in reverence. He told the parish the man had chosen to fast to the end, a gesture of deep repentance. The next was a young woman whose family had left the parish years earlier but returned in the winter to escape a harsher place. She had not yet learned that here, obedience was measured in silence. Hartwell kept her alive for weeks, speaking to her only to ask what she had learned each day. By the time her voice was gone, her body trembling from the effort of simply holding up her head, she had stopped answering altogether. Her death was timed for Palm Sunday, and Hartwell used her absence in the pews as the centerpiece of his sermon, praising the strength it took to surrender the flesh for the sake of the spirit. Others followed, chosen for reasons that made sense only to him. The parish learned to mark the days by who was missing, the air in the church growing heavier as the cellar filled again. The damp below was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, the floor slick where spilled salted water had mixed with sweat and waste. Hartwell visited each morning and each night carrying the same wooden cup, offering it to their cracked lips with a careful steadiness that could almost be mistaken for kindness. In truth, every act was measured to prolong the suffering, to keep them just far enough from death until the right day arrived. Above, the congregation prayed, sang, and kept the rhythm of the season, never speaking of what they suspected was happening beneath their feet. The sound of chains shifting in the night, the faint cries that sometimes slipped through the floorboards, were folded into the same silence that had swallowed the parish's conscience months before. For Hartwell, this was proof of the success of his methods. He had not only claimed the bodies of the chosen, but the minds of the rest. When the last of that Lent's victims died, Hartwell burned the scraps of their clothing in the hearth, the flames carrying the scent of damp wool and sweat through the rectory. The chains were left hanging in the cellar, ready for the next year, the crucifixes above them polished and upright, their carved eyes fixed in eternal watch. The scripture on the walls stood as it had before, but the teeth marks remained too, a record no prayer could erase. Hartwell looked at them often, running his fingers over the grooves, seeing not desperation but proof of how far the body would go before surrendering. He believed it justified his work, each mark another testament to the necessity of breaking the will before releasing the soul. Above ground, the thaw had begun, and the earth softened enough for burials. Hartwell oversaw each one, the graves unmarked, the bells still silent. He returned to his pulpit with a calm that made the parish lean closer to hear him speak, their eyes fixed on the man who had led them through another season of discipline. Lent had ended, but for those who had lived through it in the cellar's shadow, the fast never truly broke. The hunger remained, a quiet, hollow thing, just as he intended. Easter morning came with the sound of voices too pure for the place they filled. A choir of orphaned children stood in the chancel, their small frames wrapped in white robes, each throat marked by an identical scarf tied snug against the skin. The congregation saw only the charm of uniformity, the appearance of order and care. To Hartwell, they were something else entirely, vessels prepared for a sacrifice as deliberate as any sermon he had preached. The scarves had been measured to constrict subtly when the children lifted their heads to sing, a constant reminder of the breath they could not quite take in full. Still they sang. The sound floated through the rafters like a promise. But beneath it was the truth Hartwell alone understood. The performance was not for the living. The children had been brought to the rectory weeks before, gathered from the poorhouses and the farms that did not want them, told they would serve God in song. In Hartwell's care, they were kept apart from the rest of the parish, fed modestly, drilled on hymns until their voices blended into something without individuality. The scarves came next, presented as tokens of honor, the mark of those chosen to sing on the holiest day of the year. They did not know that each scarf hid a small loop of cord woven into the seam, a loop meant to tighten imperceptibly over time as the fabric shifted against the knot. Hartwell's hands tied each one with care, his voice warm, his eyes calm. That night, after the choir's final hymn had faded and the parishioners had gone home to their tables, the children were led in pairs to the vestry. There, Hartwell had prepared what he called the angel's breath, a bellows-driven mask modeled on the resuscitation kits once kept for drowning victims, its rubber and leather smelling faintly of oil and old air. The original device had been meant to push life into failing lungs. Hartwell's version did the opposite. The bellows did not hold clean air but smoke, thick and heavy, laced with powdered yew scraped from the trees in the churchyard. In history, yew had been planted near graves as a symbol of eternity, its poison a reminder of mortality. Hartwell had ground it fine enough to vanish into the smoke, each breath carrying the plant's slow, cold venom deeper into the body. The process was methodical. A child was seated in the wooden chair near the vestry's back wall, the mask fitted tightly over the face, the scarf pulled just enough to hold the jaw in place. The bellows pumped with a steady rhythm, smoke curling into lungs that strained for relief but found none. The U worked quickly on the smallest bodies, first blurring the mind, then weakening the muscles until only the shallowest breaths came. Hartwell watched each child's gaze shift from confusion to panic to the slack stillness he called surrender. He timed it carefully, never allowing death to come too fast. Each one needed to know they were leaving, and that he had decided it. When it was done, the bodies were laid side by side on the floor, their scarves still neatly tied, their hands folded over their chests. The room smelled of smoke and resin, the air thick enough to cling to the skin. Hartwell moved among them like a conductor ending a performance, touching each forehead as though in blessing. By dawn, the pews were draped in black. The congregation arrived to the news that the children had died in their sleep. They're passing a sign, he said, that heaven had chosen them in their purity. The parish did not question him. They nodded, murmured prayers, and accepted his words as they had accepted every loss before. Some cried at the sight of the empty choir loft, but their grief was muted, shaped into the form Hartwell allowed. The orphans had no families to claim them, no one to demand answers. And so their deaths became another thread in the fabric of silence that bound the parish together. That night, the smoke from the rectory chimney rose higher than usual, the wind carrying with it the bitter scent of yew. Those who smelled it shut their windows and told themselves it was only the burning of hymnals too worn to keep. In truth, Hartwell was ensuring nothing remained, no bodies to bury, no marks to examine. Only the scarves were kept washed and folded away, to be worn again when the next choir was found. The parish slept, comforted by the belief that innocence was rewarded in heaven. Hartwell slept, comforted by the knowledge that he had shaped the ending himself, breath by breath, in a ritual as exacting as any liturgy. The next morning his voice was steady as he preached of sacrifice, of the beauty of yielding the body so that the soul might rise. And in the loft, the absence of song seemed almost holy, as if silence itself had been consecrated by what had been taken from it. Behind the church, past the weathered fence and the thin line of yew trees, lay a patch of ground no one in the parish claimed to tend. It was not marked on any map, nor spoken of in the minutes of the church council. Yet Hartwell walked there often, his boots leaving narrow paths in the grass. This was the field of upright graves, his own private cemetery where the dead did not rest but stood, their bodies bound as though in perpetual prayer. Hartwell called it the quickening burial, a tradition he claimed was drawn from the early days of the faith, when heretics were made to wait for Christ in positions of humility. He spoke of it with the calm certainty of a man who believed the arrangement of a corpse could shape the destiny of a soul. The truth, as always, was darker. The victims were not dead when they entered the ground. Hartwell chose them in the same quiet way he had chosen all before, by measuring their defiance against the silence he demanded. They were led under cover of night to the field where a narrow pit had been dug not for lying but for standing. The width was no more than the span of their shoulders, the depth tall enough to hold them upright with their feet resting on the packed clay below. Their hands were tied in front, wrists crossed, fingers pressed together as if in prayer. The rope was drawn tight enough to cut circulation but loose enough to allow the tremors that would come as the hours passed. The burial itself was slow, almost ceremonial. Soil was shoveled in by hand, each scoop a measured weight against the chest. At first, the pressure was merely uncomfortable, the air still easy to draw in. But as the earth rose, the breathing changed, shorter pulls, sharper exhales. Hartwell kept the face uncovered until the very last, watching the change in the eyes as the victim began to understand. When the soil reached the chin, he would pause, stepping back as though giving space for a final prayer. Some tried to speak, muffled by fear, others wept without sound. Then the last handfuls were packed in, sealing them in darkness, leaving only the faint shifting of the soil as the body strained for more air. The end did not come quickly. The weight pressed against the ribs, the lungs fought for shallow gasps. The heart pounded faster to feed a body that could no longer expand to breathe. Some lasted for hours, consciousness slipping in and out, their final moments stretched into a slow collapse rather than a single break. The field itself was carefully maintained to conceal the work. Once the burial was complete, Hartwell smoothed the surface, planting grass that would grow even in disturbed soil. To the casual eye, it was simply another corner of churchland. Only the yew trees, their roots fed by what lay beneath, hinted at its true nature. He considered it a perfect method. There was no need for coffins, no need for headstones, and no one to find a body until the earth itself chose to reveal it. That revelation came after a week of heavy rain, when the clay loosened and the slope at the field's edge gave way. A pair of travelers passing along the road below saw what they first thought were tree roots protruding from the embankment. But as they drew closer, they saw faces, gray, rain-slick, eyes closed but not collapsed into the slackness of decay. The bodies had dried in place, preserved by the soil's pressure, their hands still bound in prayer. They leaned slightly forward as if straining toward something they would never reach. The travelers left without speaking to anyone in the parish, but the image followed them for miles. Hartwell heard of it before the week was out, though no one confronted him. By then, the parish had learned there was no safety in accusation. Instead, they avoided the back path that led toward the yews, their eyes turning away from the place where the ground sloped toward the road. For Hartwell, this only confirmed the method's power. Fear kept people from the field, and silence kept them from questioning why so many of their number vanished without a sound. The psychological weight of the upright graves was as deliberate as the burials themselves. Those who lived near the church found their dreams haunted by the thought of standing in the dark, feeling the earth creep higher, the air grow thinner. They imagined the hours stretching on, the body unable to move, the heart pounding against the chest in a fight it could not win. Hartwell cultivated these fears in his sermons, speaking of readiness for Christ's return, of the virtue of being found standing when the trumpet sounded. The congregation nodded, the words passing through their minds like a warning they could not quite place. He visited the field at dusk, moving among the invisible lines where each victim stood beneath the grass. He knew their names even if the parish did not, knew the order in which they had fallen silent, knew which had fought until their last breath and which had surrendered at the first touch of soil. For Hartwell, this was not simply a burial ground. It was a testament to his ability to command both body and spirit, to fix a soul in place long after the flesh had ceased to move. And as the spring rains fed the yews and the grass grew thicker over the hidden dead, the field waited, ready for the next to join the quiet congregation beneath its roots. It began on a Sunday morning that promised nothing unusual, the sky pale and still, the air holding the cool dampness of early spring. Hartwell called it the Mass of Atonement, an invitation extended to those he deemed most devout. 30 parishioners answered, arriving in their best clothes, their heads bowed as they crossed the threshold. The church door closed behind them with a muted thud, the sound of the bolt sliding into place disguised beneath the creak of the hinges. No one looked back. Hartwell had arranged the pews so they would kneel together in the open space near the altar, close enough that their shoulders touched. He moved among them with quiet authority, adjusting postures, murmuring blessings, placing each person exactly where he wanted them. Above, the vents in the ceiling, rarely noticed, never questioned, were already prepared. The lime powder waited in buckets in the loft, the pale dust light as breath but deadly when stirred. Hartwell had studied its use in plague houses decades earlier when it was believed to cleanse the air and scour away the touch of sickness. Here the sickness was sin, and the cure would be no less absolute. He began the Mass with the familiar cadence of prayer, his voice low and steady, drawing them into a rhythm that felt safe. The hymns rose soft at first, the sound of human faith wrapped in human frailty, their voices carrying upward toward the rafters where the buckets hung. At his signal, the first rope loosened, tilting the wooden slats. The powder began to fall in a steady drift, invisible at first, then swirling in pale currents that caught the light filtering through the windows. The first coughs were small, muffled by the continued singing. The lime coated their tongues, crept into their throats, burning as it went deeper. Within minutes, the air was heavy with it, the dust settling on hair, shoulders, open hands folded in prayer. Eyes began to sting, redden, and swell. The hymns faltered, the voices breaking into sharp gasps between notes. Hartwell did not pause. He walked the aisle slowly, speaking of purity, of the cleansing fire that burned without flame, his eyes calm as tears streamed down the cheeks of the kneeling. The coughing grew louder, mingling with the sound of feet shifting against the floor as they tried to breathe. Some turned their heads upward, seeking fresh air. But the vents above gave only more dust, heavier now as the second bucket was tipped. The lime bit into the soft lining of the lungs, each inhale a searing ache, each exhale weaker than the last. The congregation swayed, some collapsing forward against their neighbors, the weight of their bodies breaking the symmetry Hartwell had arranged. Still he spoke, telling them they were being carried together toward grace, that they would leave the church lighter than they had entered. His words barely reached them over the scraping coughs, the wet sound of breath breaking down, but he did not need them to hear. Only to remain where they were until it was over. By the time the last bucket emptied, the air was a white haze, the light from the windows muted. The outlines of the kneeling blurred. The hymns had stopped entirely. The only sounds were the desperate gasps of those still conscious and the soft thud of knees slipping on the worn boards as bodies gave way. The burning in their eyes had blinded many, the lime clinging to lashes seeping beneath lids to etch its way into sight. For the lungs, there was no recovery. The dust settled deep, turning every breath into a slower, shallower effort until the chest simply refused to rise again. When the coughing stopped, the silence was immediate and complete, the air so thick with powder that it muffled even the settling of the last bodies. Hartwell stood alone in the aisle, the crucifix towering behind him, the altar draped in a thin layer of white. He looked over the scene as a craftsman might study a finished work, the arrangement imperfect only in that some had fallen where they should not have. That, he knew, was the way of flesh. It always failed in the end. When the doors finally opened hours later, the smell of lime poured into the open air. Hartwell addressed those who waited outside, telling them that the 30 had ascended together, united in a moment of perfect devotion. He ordered the church to be scrubbed with vinegar, a symbolic purification he claimed would protect the living from the remnants of death. No coffins were prepared, no graves dug. The bodies were taken away under cover of night, their destination known only to him. The few who survived the Mass did not speak of it openly. They moved through the days with eyes clouded and breath thin, their voices rasping when they tried to sing. They remembered the weight of the air, the taste of lime on the tongue, the moment when the hymns faltered and they realized they were not meant to leave. But their silence was as much a part of Hartwell's work as the dust itself. In his mind, the Mass of Atonement had been a success, not simply in the number of lives claimed, but in the way it tightened the hold he had over those who remained. The locked doors had been as important as the lime. They had shown the parish that when they entered his church, the walls themselves belonged to him, and whatever happened within them was between their souls and the man who decided how they would meet their God. The arrival of the state investigator was not met with relief, but with a quiet tightening of the air in the parish, as though the wind itself had paused to listen. He came in a plain coat without the show of a uniform, his manner steady but watchful. In another place he might have been welcomed. Here his presence was a disruption, a sharp edge against the smooth, suffocating calm Hartwell had cultivated. The investigator asked questions in the tavern, in the blacksmith's yard, by the well, but the answers came slow and thin. Eyes slid away, voices lowered. The people had learned that in this parish speech could be as dangerous as sin, and both carried the same sentence. A handful did speak, quietly and in private. They told of bells that no longer rang, of graves emptied, of nights when smoke carried the scent of something that was not wood. They spoke of the locked doors, of the vanished, of the scars the parishioners did not explain. Each who came forward did so with a kind of trembling urgency, as if getting the words out might somehow lift the weight pressing on them. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the silence might break, but within days the first of them was found. He had been drowned in a horse trough behind the livery, his body still upright in the water, his hands slack, his fingernails split. Beneath one nail was a tightly rolled scrap of paper, the ink smudged but still legible, a prayer for obedience. Another followed, then another. One was a woman who had spoken of the orphan choir, found slumped over the edge of her own water barrel, her hair floating around her face, her skin pale and swollen. A prayer slip was pinned under her fingernail as well, the same hand that had once turned pages of scripture now clenched into a final, frozen fist. There was no mistaking the message. The parish saw it clearly. Those who spoke did not just die, they died in ways meant to be seen, meant to be remembered when their neighbors considered their own words. Hartwell's demeanor did not shift. His sermons continued with their usual measured cadence, the same controlled pauses, the same careful intonation. He spoke of the dangers of false testimony, of the rot that spread when lies were allowed to live. From the pulpit his eyes passed evenly over the faces below, lingering just long enough to remind each person that he knew them, that he saw them. When the investigator sat among the congregation, Hartwell did not falter. He simply adapted, speaking more often of forgiveness and the need for patience in the face of slander. He made the state's presence seem like an intrusion on sacred ground, and the parish absorbed the suggestion without question. Eventually, the investigator moved to act. Hartwell was arrested one cold morning as he stepped out of the rectory, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unchanged. There was no resistance, no protest, only the quiet composure of a man certain that the gesture was temporary. In the small holding cell in town, he remained as he had always been. Calm, articulate, willing to answer questions without ever giving the answers that mattered. The case against him was thin, dependent on the words of witnesses who now refused to speak again. Those who had been willing were gone, their bodies taken by water, their prayers nailed into their flesh. Without them, the state had nothing but suspicion. And suspicion was not enough to hold a man whose collar shielded him as much as his influence. Within a week, Hartwell returned to the parish. The bells did not ring for his homecoming, but the air was thick with the unspoken acknowledgement that he had beaten them. He stepped into the pulpit the following Sunday as if nothing had passed, the cadence of his voice unbroken, the rhythm of his service unchanged. The parishioners watched him with a mixture of fear and something darker, a resigned acceptance that the man who stood before them could not be touched by the laws beyond their borders. Historical parallels were easy to draw, though no one in the parish dared to name them aloud. In the early years of the century, clergy across the country had been shielded by the weight of their titles, protected from prosecution by the very communities they preyed upon. The church was its own court, its own sanctuary, and within its walls the law often stopped at the door. Hartwell knew this history well and wore it like armor. He had crafted his power on the understanding that faith could be twisted into a leash, and once it was fastened, no outside force could pull it free. The investigator left soon after, his presence absorbed back into the wider world, his questions unanswered. The deaths of those who had spoken were never officially linked, never named as the warnings they truly were. Hartwell's control had not only survived the state's intrusion, it had grown stronger, fed by the public proof that even when accused he returned unbroken. The parish understood then, if they had not before, that there was no escape through the telling of truths. Words here were not tools of justice, but triggers for judgment, and the one who passed that judgment stood smiling at the altar, speaking of mercy in a voice that had never known it. He died without ceremony, in a narrow bed in the upper ward of the Boston Asylum, the kind of place built to keep its inmates away from the city's conscience. By then, Reverend Hartwell was an old man, his hair gone to white, his frame shrunken to little more than bone beneath a plain wool blanket. There was no priest at his side, no family to hold his hand, only the night attendant who found him with his eyes half open, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. He had never confessed. Not to the doctors who came with questions, not to the chaplain who tried to offer him absolution, not even in his rare moments of weakness when the weight of years pressed him into silence. He carried his truth with him into the dark, the same way he had carried his authority, close to the chest, untouchable. The parish he had ruled was gone long before his final breath. The church had been abandoned within a decade of his arrest and release, the pews left to warp in the damp, the roof sagging under the weight of winters no one cared to shield it from. Eventually the building was torn down, the ground cleared as if removing the structure might erase what had happened inside. Yet the earth remembered. Those who had lived under his hand avoided the place, their steps veering wide of the lot even when nothing remained but grass. No one tried to rebuild. It was as if the land itself had been condemned, not by law but by the unspoken judgment of those who knew. In the town his name was not spoken aloud. To the children born after, Hartwell was no more than a shadow in the pauses of their elders' conversations, a figure hinted at but never explained. Parents warned against curiosity. Questions were met with silence or a sharp change of subject. The absence of his name became a kind of ritual in itself, a barrier between the present and the memory of what he had done. Yet silence did not mean forgetting. It meant carrying the memory without letting it surface, a burial of truth that mirrored his own methods. Over the years, fragments of his work survived in ways few recognized. His obsession with control over the dead seeped into obscure public health codes in Massachusetts, statutes governing how bodies could be prepared, stored, and buried. The language was careful, stripped of its origins, but in the margin notes of archived drafts, there were traces of the same thinking he had preached, that the body must be contained, that the dead must be kept in forms that served the living's moral order. Later moral reform movements borrowed from his rhetoric without knowing the source, repeating his ideas about purification and readiness for divine judgment in pamphlets distributed to parishes across the state. Even the memorials to his victims were not safe. In the mid-20th century, when a small group of descendants attempted to place plaques in their honor, the markers were quietly removed within a year. Officially, it was due to vandalism and upkeep costs. Unofficially, there were those who still feared that naming the dead might stir something best left untouched. The gaps where the plaques had been became another kind of silence, the empty stone faces as telling as words could have been. The asylum records show nothing remarkable about his final days. No outbursts, no decline into incoherence. He ate sparingly, walked the ward when weather allowed, and attended the chapel services without comment. To the staff who knew only the old man, he seemed almost gentle. But in the few visitors who came, rare, reluctant, there was always a shift, a tightening around the eyes as if they still saw the man who had decided how others would live and die, who had shaped their ends as carefully as a mason shapes stone. The truth of Hartwell's life remains in fragments, scattered in county archives and whispered family stories, in the faint outlines of laws and customs he influenced. What is certain is that his greatest legacy was not the number of lives he ended, but the silence he left behind. A silence so complete that it outlasted him, outlasted the walls of his church, and settled over the community like a second skin. The absence of his name became as permanent as the earth over his victims. Evil like his does not thrive in noise. It prefers the stillness, the slow turning away of eyes, the shared agreement not to look too closely. It survives in the spaces where truth is allowed to rot, where memory is dulled not by time but by choice. Hartwell understood this better than most. It was the thread that tied every act he committed, the rope that bound his victims in life and bound the living in fear after. Now, more than a century later, the question remains whether what happened in that parish was an aberration or a pattern. The walls are gone, the yew trees cut down, the records dust-covered in forgotten drawers. Yet the silence endures, heavy as ever, proof that the past is never truly buried. It only waits for the moment when it can return. What do you think? Could this happen again?